The recording. Hello, welcome to the second OERup webinar. My name is Kevin Campbell-Wright from NIACE and I'm pushing the buttons behind the scenes. But I'd like to introduce to you Marc Romero, who is going to tell you a little bit about the agenda and where we're going today before introducing our expert. So Marc, if you want to start your camera and microphone now, then we can go there.
Hello.
Hi,
okay,
Marc.
thank you.
Hear you, we
okay.
can't see you, so you may need to click start sharing on your camera so that we can see you as well.
Okay.
There we go. Lovely. Hiya, Marc.
Hello. Can everybody hear me? Can you hear me, Kevin?
And yes.
Okay. Thank you so much, Kevin, for the technical introduction and for setting up the Adobe Connect program. Hi, I'm Marc Romero. I'm from UOC, Open University of Catalonia. It's a fully online university that is based in Barcelona. And we are partners of the OERup project. That is it's an Erasmus Plus project, as some of you will know. I will just introduce you the agenda. I will explain you very briefly the project because some of you may not know the project. Then I will give the word to our expert, Anthony Camilleri, who will talk about quality assurance regarding OER. Then we will have the time for questions and answers. And finally, I will explain summary and next steps of the project. So, the OERup stands for Open Educational Resources Uptake in Adult Education. It's, as I said, an Erasmus Plus project that lasts 2 years. We started at September 2014 and will end at August 2016. We work as partners of the project as the MFG from Germany, that is the leading of the project, NIACE from Great Britain, Sophia from Italy, and ARIA from Romania. The principal aim of the project takes up the need to promote and foster the successful implementation of OER and OEP in adult education in Europe in order to widen participation in open education. As you can see here in the slide, I will explain briefly the phases of the project. First, we run a need analysis based on desk research and some interviews that we had with some experts in adult education in the different countries that are part of the project. It was developed during December until February of this year. We use that data in order to design our training concept that we are testing now. And we are running now the pilot during the from April, and it will end in May. Is the some of you, I guess you are in the pilot. So first of all, it's a blending learning concept. So it will be primarily online, and there will be some face-to-face sessions in Stuttgart, Great Britain, and Timisoara. And from this training development, we will have some training material and guidelines that you will be able to use in order to promote OER in your institutions. During Anthony's presentation, I would like, in order to make this webinar a little interactive, to answer to the participants a question. The question will be you can see the question during the presentation. So you will have the chat box in order to respond. The question is, based on your experience, which quality criteria and quality assurance processes apply in order to search, evaluate, and repurpose the resources you use. So I kindly ask you to ask this question in order to promote interaction. Finally, I will introduce you our today's expert. Is Anthony, as you know, is Anthony Camilleri. He's a policy consultant, project manager, and quality and standardization expert. He's co-author of the European Commission report, State of the Art Review of Quality Issues Related to Open Educational Resources. He works to the Knowledge Innovation Center and in the International Organization for Standardization. And you have here the link of his blog. So, Anthony, whenever you're ready, you can start. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everybody. I've been given a very interesting title to talk about today, and I've been asked to talk about quality assurance of open educational resources. And in thinking of this title, one of the things I want to say straight out is I'm not going to be telling you what a quality open educational resource is. Quite frankly, I don't have a clue what a quality OER is. And in every case, you are going to be finding that it will be you who in the end needs to determine what a quality OER is. What I can do is hopefully give you a few tips, give you a few guidelines on what are the factors you need to consider, what you need to look at when you are looking at OER. I understand that in the first part of this series, you were talking a lot about what OER are, what is the definition of OER. And unlike a traditional resource, an OER is often a living document, a living resource, which depending on what stage of its development you encounter it, is which part of the instructional design process it will affect. What that means is that if you have a traditional textbook, you can actually quality assure it at a particular point in time and always apply a consistent process. With an OER, it really depends which part of the instructional design process you are encountering it in. So what I will actually be doing today is walking you through the different parts of an instructional design process involving OER and explaining what steps of quality can be applied at each one of these instructional design steps. Before anything, let's have a look at how an open educational resource differs from a traditional resource. Now, at the most basic level, the only difference between an open resource and a traditional resource is the license. The license allowing anybody to edit it, to repurpose it, to reuse it. However, when you see the effects of this license on resources, it means that open resources are actually very, very different. When you're creating a traditional resource, you will usually have an author who starts work on it, spends some time writing, finishes a draft, then it will move to an editor who will do some improvements and upgrades on it, and then it will move to an evaluation process where it's checked and then published. In an OER, all of this is blurred, with authoring, editing, evaluation happening in a constant cycle, and usually not a single person in charge of each process. So if you just think of one of the more famous examples of OER, say a Wikipedia article, it is constantly being authored, edited, and evaluated all at the same time by a community of people. You don't have these isolated single processes following each other. Because of this also, you don't have a definitive published edition. You can't say this is the first edition of the OER, this is the second edition of an OER. Because different people are using it and reusing it in different ways, you will often have many different editions which are published simultaneously and which are equally valid. And also, because these are published on the internet and reused, it means that effectively they are published forever. There is no procedure for retraction of an OER. You can't really say that, listen, the second edition replaces the first edition and hope that the first edition has been scrubbed from memory. So all of these things mean that open resources are significantly different. And if you look at the life cycle of an OER, a life cycle of an OER will look something like this. And as you can see, it is very non-linear and it is quite complicated. We would usually start at the bottom left of this diagram with initiating the process to create it. Initiating the process will lead to authoring an OER, describing it, and an initial release of an OER. If I'm describing these too shortly, don't worry, I'll be going into each of these steps in my presentation. Once we release it to the public, we start with the constant quality assurance and improvement cycle, what we call a check-edit cycle, where people read it, check it, make edits, and continue the cycle. This leads to approval, publishing, discovery, and then it goes into the use repurposing cycle, where it is used, repurposed, integrated into other resources, and so on and so forth. And then quite often, all of that is used to create entirely new resources, starting this cycle again. And this usage scenario for OER is what we can also use to quality assure OER, since each one of these individual steps can actually be quality assured. To start from the beginning of the cycle is initiating the circle. And initiating the circle involves essentially the definition of learning objectives. Since you would be thinking about creating an open educational resource, then you would be wanting to actually figure out what the educational purposes of it are. When you're defining learning objectives, there are a couple of quality criteria you would keep in mind. And at least at this stage, there is no real difference between creating an open educational resource and another type of educational resource. Because the quality criteria here would be, how did you involve the stakeholders in the creating of the learning objectives? In other words, did you do a needs analysis with your students? Did you consider the needs of the wider society, of industry? Did you understand the needs of the institution? And so on and so forth. It also means that, have you considered the technical quality of the learning objectives themselves? And when we're talking about the technical quality of learning objectives, what we're saying is, are they, first of all, focused on outcomes? And secondly, have they been written in a behavior condition format type? A behavior would be the verb. So, for example, the student will be able to recognize the main elements of quality assurance OER, the condition in the context of a university course, and the criterion, for example, at introductory level. And that is simple enough, and I think it's a procedure you are all quite familiar with. Once you've initiated it, you then need to move towards authoring the OER. And again, authoring for an open educational resource is very, very similar to creating an educational resource. And the type of quality criteria you might use is asking yourself, is this material academically sound? Is it appropriate for the body of knowledge? Is it pedagogically robust? And does it match the pedagogical model? When we're talking about the pedagogical model, sometimes in OER you would actually be thinking of using a pedagogical model which actually integrates the authoring and the re-editing of the resource as part of that pedagogical model, and is the material presented in the most appropriate way to achieve the learning outcomes. And these are the normal things you would consider when authoring. When authoring, you also need to figure out who will actually check the quality of the authoring. And this depends on the context of who is authoring the OER and in what kind of institution. For this context, we need to make a distinction between what we call big OER and small OER. Big OER are things like courses, MOOCs, and so on, offered by existing institutions. And where this is the case, they are usually covered by existing quality procedures within those institutions. So if you think about giving a normal lecture within a normal university, nobody comes and formally signs off on that lecture before you give it to a class. The quality of that lecture is covered by the overall quality assurance procedures of the institution you are in. And when the OER is produced within the context of an institution, those same quality procedures are sufficient to ensure the quality of the OER. However, when we're talking about small OER, and this would be individual materials produced by individual educators independently, then there needs to be checks done by the community or by the repository owners further down the line, and we'll be talking about in the coming slides some of those checks you can do. Once we've authored our OER, a very, very important step, which you usually would not find for a normal educational resource, is the description of that resource. The quality criteria here is very, very simple, and that is, has the resource been described and fully described in as much detail possible using a prevailing metadata standard. There are a number of different metadata standards, such as Dublin Core, such as SCORM, such as learning objects, but it doesn't really matter which metadata standard you use, as long as you're using a commonly used one, you do it fully, and that one is machine readable, because it's absolutely essential to have the metadata to actually make it discoverable. And discoverability leads us to our next step. And the next step is release of the open educational resource. Now, because the open educational resource has been newly produced, we do make a distinction between release and publishing further on. So essentially, in the release step, we are talking about making the open educational resource available for purposes of improvement of the resource itself, not necessarily for mass consumption. The quality criteria of the release itself, so how good has the release been, would be things like how broadly have you released it? So how many people actually have access to this to improve it? How active is the community it is released to? It's one thing if you just release it on your blog and say, I have created this resource, please give me your comments. It's a completely different matter if you release it within a very active community of professionals, which are likely to give you significant feedback. And thirdly, how expert is the community it is released to? Obviously, the more expert the community is, the better the type of feedback you would get on the open educational resource. And once it's released, we enter into the check, edit, approve cycle. To understand the check, edit, approve cycle, it's important to understand what type of quality assurance checks we would use for a traditional resource. And typically, traditional resources would have 3 levels of checks, which may be implemented partially or wholly depending on how extensive the quality assurance system is. Firstly, you would have a self-reflection or internal check. And this is simply enough the author quality checking their own work and consequently improving it, usually in line with a set of criteria. In peer review, external experts would judge the work in question and make suggestions for improvement, which would then be returned to the original author, and the original author would make improvements based on the recommendations of the peer review. And finally, you would have external review or approval, where an editor, who's usually one person or one committee, will put a final stamp of approval on this and say, this is good enough, this can be released, this can be published. The features of a traditional review are that it is extremely centralized. You only have one final person or committee that signs off on it. You only will typically have 2 or 3 peer reviewers that rule on the quality. As far as possible, it is free of conflict of interest, and everybody involved in the process has to state that they have a very clear, that they very clearly do not have conflict of interest. It's usually based on determinate criteria. So wherever you are releasing it, being it in a journal, or be it a textbook, or be it lesson material, there will be specific defined quality criteria which this work is ranked on. And it is usually informed by users' needs, but it's usually not run by the users themselves. Now, on the other hand, if we look at an open educational resource, where checking and editing is open to everybody, again, take the example of a wiki or take the example of an open document where it has been released and different people may edit it, may approve it, and so on, then we see that all the processes are actually merged into one. So anybody can go in, they can read it, they can make edits to it. Those edits may be in the form of judging or recommendation. There's no real approval process, since you're going through a constant cycle of peer creation, peer validation, reflection, review, editing, enriching, and you're just going through multiple cycles of this. And because you have different people working on this at once, not only do you have one consecutive cycle constantly running, but quite often you'll have multiple cycles of checking and editing continually running at the same time. So if we have a look at how a traditional review would differ from what we might call a check-edit review or a peer assistance review, there are many differences in how it's done, who's involved, and what the final results are. So the traditional review, the typical aim would be to evaluate, for example, a paper. While in peer assistance, rather than just evaluating it, the idea is collaborative improvement of knowledge. While the task would be to criticize a paper in a traditional review, in peer assistance, the task would be to learn with a team and through a team. In a traditional review, reviewers are selected by an independent body, and specific people will always act as a reviewer. Help review it, and you will often have different roles as a reviewer and as an editor simultaneously, since you usually would not just make comments on the paper, but you would actually make those comments in line as suggestions for changes. In terms of guidelines and a report, in a traditional review, you would have the specific guidelines and you would write a report on how the paper or how the resource in question adheres to those guidelines. On the other hand, in peer assistance, you would go in and have very, very broad criteria, and you would review based on your own subjective understanding, and the process, through the process, you are actually creating the report by implementing improvements. And so this is how the check, edit, approve function would work. As I mentioned earlier, there is a difference between release and publication. So release is generally for the improvement of the document, but at some point you say, listen, we've gone through a number of check, edit cycles, and we feel that this is useful for wider consumption. It has reached a quality level where it's good for wider consumption. And at this point, we need to think about how to publish it. And essentially, there are only a couple of quality criteria for publication, and both of them are linked to how discoverable you make the object. First and foremost, you have to ask, is the resource traceable? And by traceable, we mean or object identifier or something of the sort. Secondly, we have to ask, has it been put in the most important or common repositories? And there are two elements to this. First of all is digital discoverability, which essentially means putting it in the right online resources and making sure the metadata works properly. But as you will know, doesn't mean it can be found by the people who need to use it. So a very important and often overlooked part of discoverability is ensuring human discoverability. And that means posting in the forums of the communities that would be interested in the publication, posting in blogs, posting in news sites, and doing other types of promotion which would ensure that it is promoted in being able to rate the resource from 1 to 5 or use a star system based on whatever criteria the repository gives you. Now, social ranking compared to the traditional review you would usually have in an institution is again a very, very, very different creature. So we already talked about traditional review. It is done by specific named reviewers according to very strict quality criteria who produce a report which is used by the author of the resource or by the management of the institution of the resource. Social rating, on the other hand, is completely different. First of all, it is done individually by every person who does the rating, since you work individually to give a star rating. Those may be then aggregated, but there is no collaborative work in doing the ranking. Secondly, absolutely anybody can do the ranking, and the people who are doing the ranking are usually not reviewers. They are consumers of the resource, they might be even authors or editors of the new resource, and so it's a completely different audience of people who are doing that ranking. There are no real guidelines except the one sentence you would find next to the ranking box, which might be how useful is this resource, or it might say do you intend to use this resource, or it might just say quality of the resource, or it might actually just say stars 1 to 5. And the purpose of this is not to inform the author or the institution of the author. The purpose of all of this is actually to inform the users who will actually be using the resource. So the evaluation and rating here is a completely different creature to what you might find in traditional resources. So to come over to my final thought, if you take anything from this presentation, I'd like you to take 2 points. That the quality of open educational resources is a function, first of all, of the academic quality of the resource. And the academic quality of a resource is something you are all familiar with judging, you are all familiar with doing on a daily basis. What's unique about open educational resources is actually the openness. And if you want to do quality open educational resources, you need to find ways to measure the quality of the openness, which means how reusable is it? How well described is it? How discoverable is it? What type of ranking do you have? How are you promoting the collaboration? And you have to look at all of these criteria which are saying, listen, are we taking advantage of the open nature of the resource to the highest extent possible? And if you can answer yes to that, and you have the academic quality there, then I would argue that you're well on the track towards quality OER. I would be very, very happy to take your questions.
For Anthony.
I'm right here.
Does anyone has a question for Anthony?
I don't know whether...
I see that. Yeah, okay. I see that someone is typing. Okay, so thank you, Maria, for your question. Based on your experience, Anthony, as an expert, which are the main challenges regarding quality of OER? Can you give a quick answer to that question, please?
Okay, so the main challenges for quality of OER is actually a very, very complicated question. If I had to choose one, I would say that as I've been describing this lifecycle model, it's all a very, very communal approach. It's all about having the right experts reviewing it at the right time, reusing it, and entering this constant cycle of improvement. It all works very well in theory, that you will publish something online and you will get constant iterative review. But the truth is, actually building vibrant communities of experts who constantly peer review each other's work is actually very complicated, it's very hard, and if I had to choose one challenge, I would say that is the challenge. To do traditional resources, it's much easier. You choose 2 reviewers, you bug them by email, and eventually they will review your resource. But if you're publishing a resource to an empty community and not getting any feedback, and not having the normal review procedures from the traditional review, then you might end up without the necessary feedback to improve. So I would say that if I had to choose one #1 challenge, it would be that. Finding the right experts and actually creating this community of self-improvement. Or rather peer improvement.
Okay, thank you, Anthony. Thank you, Anne, for your comment. She likes wide release to an active expert community as quality measure for OER. It fits better with living resources and classical peer review. Thank you. Okay, does anyone more has a question? Okay, if not, sorry, Miss.
Mark, do we want people to answer your question before we move on? Yeah. So if people look at the question that Mark has got up, I'll just make it a little bit bigger. That based on your experience, which quality criteria, quality assurance processes apply in order to search, evaluate and repurpose the resources you use? Maybe people could just type into the your answers box their thoughts on that.
Okay, thank you for sharing, Kira and Maria. Reviewing can search for many resources to take a decision and try to establish some criteria. The most important, open license and exceptions to their needs. Great, thank you. I would like just before to end the webinar and talk about the next steps, just last question for having in mind that the project is it points at adult education educators, which advice would you give to some institution or adult educator that is starting searching, using and repurposing OER regarding quality? So if you have to summarize some steps for someone that is starting with the issue, what would you recommend? Sorry, Anthony, we cannot hear you. Can you put on the mic, please?
Yes, microphones are useful when you're trying to speak. If you're just starting out and if you're looking for, and if you're trying to find open educational resources and you're trying to repurpose it, what I can advise you is do not start as an individual. There are plenty of great repositories for adult education out there, but if you're just going to be using the search box and bringing up a list of 50 resources and then reading through those resources and deciding which ones to integrate, you're using maybe 10% of the potential of open educational resources. The real advantage, the real benefit that will come from open educational resources will be from engaging with the community that are with those resources. Get in touch with the authors of the resources. Get active on the forums. Get active in the community and do this first. Then the community will help point you to the best resources. You will be able to make your contributions to the community and you will be able to get the most out of all of it.
Oh, great. Okay, great, Anthony. Thank you. Okay, so we will finish the webinar. Thank you, everybody, for assisting. I just will briefly explain the next steps regarding our training and our project. We invite you to join the course on Teachable. You have here the website. And it will be next webinar in November, the 25th, about open pedagogies with Gron Conole. So we invite you to go to this webinar and to stay tuned to our Google Plus community OERup. And we will upload this webinar in our Google Plus website as well. So thank you, everybody, and see you soon.
Thank you, everybody, again, and thank you, everybody who's watched the recording. We're going to stop the recording now.